Welcome to another episode of TIDES. I'm your host, Shveta Malhan, and today we are diving into a question that's shaking up the HR world. How deep should HR go as AI shapes the future? Here's the deal. AI is everywhere, and it's changing the way we work faster than most of us can keep up. And for HR, this isn't about adopting new tools. It's about redefining how we connect people, technology, and culture. But how deep does HR need to go? Should we explore the basics, or do we need to plunge into the technical depths of AI? To help us navigate this big question, I'm thrilled to welcome Lydia Wu. Lydia is a straight-talking, no-fluff leader in HR and tech world, and she's been in the trenches transforming HR teams and working with vendors to deliver solutions that actually work. If you've ever felt like AI is too overwhelming or vendors are asking you too much to do, Lydia's perspective is going to be a game changer. So buckle up. This is going to be an honest, practical, and thought-provoking conversation about the future of HR and AI. So let's get started. Lydia, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me here.
All right, Lydia, you've had a very impressive career at the intersection of HR, technology, and AI. And you describe yourself as having a love-hate relationship with HR. Can you elaborate on that and how it shapes your current work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like most of our listeners, if not some of our listeners, I fell into the world of HR by accident. It was purely out of desire at the very beginning to not be fired from my very first job in consulting, essentially. But long story short, I fell in love with this space. I fell in love with the idea that people are nebulous. They're probably one of the mushiest, I would say, parts of an organization to manage to have control over because of the unpredictability of human nature that is part of the organization. I love HR for that particular reason because you're working with a constant, multi-dimensional and constant changing entity, essentially, with every single person in your workforce and every single one of your employees coming at things with a different context, a slightly different approach. It's almost like not one person is alike, especially in the workforce, even if they're occupying the same title. So that's a love part of it. It's out of sheer curiosity and just needing to understand how does this work. The not so loving part of it, if you will, or the hate part of it is I don't know what it is with how HR has operated, but it's almost like we have been automating the 1980s since the 1980s when it comes to technology. Like if you think about how payroll is done, or if you think about how benefits are delivered, it's pretty much the 80s on a digital screen with a couple prettier icons and a better UI. But the fundamental process of becoming more human, of delivering a more human and a more user-friendly experience, that hasn't been there. And I'm still not seeing it, interestingly, even with all of the AI advancements that's happening.
So that is very interesting because I thought with AI advancing, things would start to change. I know it takes time. So when we think about AI and transformation, specifically related to future of HR, what excites you most and what concerns you? Do you not see HR as an enabler to kind of take away all the shackles that we've had in the past?
So on the same thought train, I think what excites me the most is, if you recall, I would say for maybe the past 20, 30 years, ever since we have had that three-legged HR operating model that most people are using in their organizations, it's been a constant conversation of how does HR get out of the admin work? How do you not have to look at every single phone call, every single email, every single ticket that comes across your desk? And as much as we've been automating a lot of things, it hasn't really been intelligent automation. We've just sort of said it's rule-based automation, right? Just sort of like, if you see A, do B, if you see B, do C, that type of thing. And that doesn't help HR because, like I said, people are nebulous. Every case that comes across your desk has some nuance to it that the rules themselves don't catch most of the time, which is why often I think a lot of HR folks implement technology and end up having to do the work anyway. Well, it's because the technology hasn't always accounted for the nuances historically. With AI, what excites me the most is its ability to account for those nuances and in the sense of the intelligent automation. So it's not fully generative artificial intelligence, I think most HR teams are using, but even just in intelligent automation alone, that gets rid of a bulk of the admin and operational work that most HR folks are concerned about doing and want to get out of. So it brings me tons of excitement to know that there is finally a piece of technology out there, or a category of technology out there, that can elevate and catapult HR people out of the sort of, I'm going to call it fire drill spiral that we've constantly been in. What scares me the most is I wonder if, technology aside, HR processes are ready for that change, and if our HR teams are thinking about the change in their processes. And I'll give you the perfect example of this. So I was working with a company a while back, and they were talking to me, they're a SharePoint user. They were talking to me about how they have about 30,000 SharePoint pages, or files, I guess, in their ecosystem. And it's all the historical content dating back 5-6 years. So you can imagine 5-6 years worth of benefit plans, 5-6 years worth of bonus plans, all of that fun stuff. And they were like, yeah, we've been talking to a lot of AI vendors, and they just told us that as long as we pop their technology on top of it, the technology can solve all of it. But here's the thing. Technology doesn't solve a broken process. Technology doesn't solve a broken stack. So in order for AI to do its work, there has to be some fundamental cleansing that is required in the HR data, and how we structure our processes and how we structure our data stack. I'm not quite sure if that connection has been made in the market yet. And I'm genuinely concerned about it, because what's going to happen if you don't make that connection is that HR folks are going to think AI will solve my entire world's problems, which it should. But then they'll buy a piece of technology that was sold to them for more than what it's worth. And then they're going to plug it in and have a moment of like, well, this is just like any other piece of thing that I have plopped in. It was supposed to work. I was sold on it working. I've hedged my entire political capital in my career against it. And now I have to throw more bodies against the equation. So that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, the phrase that I use is that movie title, Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yes.
So AI is not just impacting HR, it's also impacting all aspects of an organization. And if HR is right now redefining itself, it has to do that piece quickly, because the business is also simultaneously reinventing themselves. All functional areas of the business have to go through maybe process changes. Maybe the anatomy of different parts of the organizations would look different. Maybe some capabilities might completely disappear and some might appear, which we haven't thought about. So seismic shifts that are happening across the organization. And this kind of a situation, how should HR think about learning about AI as a technology, because it impacts everything? Should they become experts at it, or should they know enough to make right choices and decisions? What's your take on that?
So I think I'm going to normalize something for our audience right now, which is it is so normal and absolutely expected for you not to know everything. If you ever talk to a vendor, or if you ever talk to anyone who will make you feel like lesser than for not knowing, then my question wouldn't be your knowledge base. My question would be whether that party is the right partner for you on the AI journey that you're about to embark on. Because here's the thing, I spend most of my time, and I would say probably like over 10 hours a day on a regular basis, studying the AI world, studying the impacts of AI on HR, the global economy, and everything else. Even then, I still wouldn't come out and claim that I know everything. So I can only imagine for an HR professional who is probably 12 hours a day on their laptops or doing their firefighting roles, being able to even squeeze out that 15-20 minutes a day to look into AI. And that's why I always tell people, like, don't expect to know everything. What HR folks, I think, need to focus on in this juncture is really the fundamentals of HR, which is the human parts. Because to your point, businesses are going through the transformation. There's a huge seismic shift. And this is one of those seismic shifts that it didn't happen in waves. Like normally when we see a technology change, it's sort of like the consumer market, the financial markets experience it, the consumer market experiences, the business market experiences, and then it lands in HR. To your point, it's everything everywhere all at once. Everyone is experiencing it, but somehow HR is a function that also ends up on top of everything with the responsibility of change management and taking the workforce through this whole nebulous situation, if you will. So I think for the HR folks out there listening to this, it's absolutely fine for you to dot the surface because you're not meant to be a deep diver, if you will, on all of the AI topics. That's why you have all the technology partners in your organization. That's why you have all of your vendor partners. But on the surface, I would say focus on what started the HR function to begin with, which is how do you manage humans through this? Because even with AI coming around, humans aren't going away. Like humans are still responsible for that creation part, the data that is required to go into the training of an AI. AI is really good at repeating and generating things from existing data, but we're still the ones that have to get creative about the types of problem and everything else we're looking to solve.
And do you think that there are any risks that HR leadership, HR professionals should be prepared for as they strike the right balance between how much they should know about AI and how much they should probably strike an alliance with experts in their ecosystem to know and partner with?
Yes, I think for all the HR leaders listening to this, I wouldn't necessarily say there is a risk because balance doesn't quite exist in this world anymore in terms of what works, what doesn't. Up until 2 weeks ago, you could have told me that, hey, we figured out the enterprise version of ChatGPT, everything's cool. And then boom, all of us in the industry got hit out of nowhere with the DeepSeek models, which basically performs at way less cost than the GPT models out there. So with the advancement and pace of which technology is coming to the market, it is a constant adjustment of levers, I would say. My piece of advice to all of the HR leaders listening to this is just pick any model or any tool that you're comfortable with using, even if it is Google and Google Gemini. Try it out. Have that on your phone and use that as your go-to person to at least ask the question. Like when you're in a meeting room and someone throws out a term that you don't understand, pop it into ChatGPT, pop it into Gemini, pop it into Anthropic. Take your pick, literally, of the tool sets out there and see what those answers are. And then from your knowledge of that, figure out how you want to react to it. Because I will say, you don't have to react to every piece of news that is in the market. While the technology is advancing quite rapidly, it still takes a while for that technology to find its applicability into the HR realms, if you will. And you still have time, not a lot of time, but you still have time.
Absolutely. I love this example that you shared about, in a way, being hands-on with AI, because the more you use it, the more you not only understand the technical nuances of it, which we don't have to as HR professionals, but it helps us understand how to apply the power of AI in day-to-day context, and which is so important because at the end of the day, the problem that collectively organizations are trying to solve for is so big, so complicated that no one person has all the answers. And the more people in HR like us are hands-on with the technologies and tools that are relevant to us in our context, the better suited we will be to have that cross-functional conversation. So when a CIO or CTO or CEO and a chief people officer sit together and CPO has had lived experiences, the conversational dynamics will be very different than, not having any hands-on lived experience with this technology. So I love that.
Absolutely. And I think if I can just add something here, it's about the context of which you're approaching this whole thing, right? A lot of times you'll hear the terms related to AI and it's like, ooh, I don't know about this or I'm not comfortable about this. You don't have to be, because what you need to know, and I think the perfect illustration of this is in a lot of AI usage policies that organizations are trying to roll out and HR teams are somehow at the end holding it together. Most AI policies only work in the moment in time that they're created because of how rapidly advancing it is. And some of the CPOs I've spoken with, the ones who have experimented and understand the nebulous changes that are happening in the world, they're putting out AI policies in terms of a guidance, not specifically what are you allowed to do with the data, what are you allowed to do with the tool, etc., but more so on principle. How do you need to think about organizational data? How do you need to think about the personal information you're putting out there? How do you need to think about the tools that you're loading onto your organizational devices and things along those lines? And I think that shows you the delta between needing to know everything on the technical side or feeling like you need to know everything on the technical side versus taking a step back and focusing on people and focusing on the principles instead.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My next question out of curiosity is around how do you see, or let me phrase it like this. I feel like AI has brought existential moment for HR and many functions. Like I use marketing as an example with AI agents. If the consumer behavior changes and we don't shop, but our agents shop on our behalf, how does that impact the marketing department? They have to think about now selling to machines versus humans. So it rewires their complete anatomy. Do you see AI as a technology that puts HR in that existential moment?
I think depends on the type of HR shop you run. Yes, I do, because whether we like it or not, there are conversations that are happening in my ecosystem in terms of what does a future of HR look like? Do you even need HR in the organization anymore if the machines themselves can do the processing, the paper pushing, and everything else? So I think in that sense, it's existential because of the work that we have been doing, right? It's going back to, again, the strategic versus the admin work. It's that propulsion to move into the strategic, but at the same time, understanding very quickly what does strategic look like in execution and not just in conversation. One of the more nuanced conversations I've been having a lot is yes to the strategic conversations, but in order to quote unquote have a seat at the table, which we've been talking about as an industry for way too long, you need to understand the financials. You need to understand the P&L. You need to be able to look at the movements on Wall Street and just the global money markets and understand how that's going to impact your organization, your people, and everything else. I'm not certain that every HR professional came out of school knowing that, nor am I certain that everyone has developed that acumen over time, despite the fact that that's truly what's needed. Because that's the part that I don't think AI can replace in terms of connecting the dots of everything around the world and putting it into the context of your organization, your workforce, and what you need to look forward to in that regard. So if I would say your organization is purely focused on the admin and the operation part of it, like keeping the lights on, keeping people happy, yeah, there is a moment of reckoning coming if it's not here already. I mean, like we're seeing the budget cuts. As much as we can tell ourselves, oh, it's because of the economy and everything else, there's also a reason why IT is getting funded in certain cases, procurement's getting funded in certain cases, but HR is being constantly asked to do more with less. However, I think if there is a pivot to that strategic angle in terms of understanding not just how you execute strategically, but how do you tell a story? How do you strategically manage your stakeholders and putting people into the middle of that conversation of the business? I think there is something to be said about allowing technology to enhance how you do your job and then designing how you want the future processes to look like without having to continuously throw bodies against the execution.
And what do you see the role of data in this equation or this transformation from HR being operational to becoming strategic? Is that one of the key ingredients? And are there other ingredients which you would think are key for HR to transition from being operational to strategic? Because to your point, not every HR function is strategic, neither is every function operational, and there are many in between.
So I'm going to paraphrase something I think Josh Bersin said a while back, which is every AI company is a data company. This is where we're going to dive a little deeper into the tech part of AI for just like maybe 30 seconds. In order for LLMs, which is the backing of generative AI to work, there has to be a training process. In order to train, there has to be data. And for those of you listening to this, I will highly encourage you to look at what the AI data wall phenomenon is that's happening right now. But long and short of it, AI works so well in our world right now because we have an overabundance of data to train it. Now, taking that bigger lens into the individual organization's lens, in order to train an AI model to understand your context, your organization, everything else, you need to have organizational data, which means you would have needed to collect that data, which means you would have needed to like architect that data. So I think in the world that we're pivoting into right now, for me, it's about the data, but not just the volume of data. It's about the framework, the architecture, and the structure, if you will, that one would put around their data, their processes, and everything else. And I think this is a conversation a lot of people analytics folks have been having for the last 5-10 years, which I also think is why people analytics always get saddled with the AI task in HR sometimes. It's because of the data, right? Because the conversation that in people analytics that's been happening, it's like, if you don't capture the data at the stage that it needs to be captured, there's no way I can analyze it for you. So take a talent acquisition funnel, for example. If you don't capture the number of candidates that drop out in every stage along the way, it's like, well, I can't build a funnel for you because all I know is how many entered and how many exited. we don't know what the dropout rate is. We don't know why they dropped out, nor can we go back and research that. So it's about designing a process and a framework in terms of how you want to think about every one of your HR functions, tasks, whatever it may be, and then understanding what data you need to capture, and then fast forwarding to figure out how AI can be dropped on top of that to expedite the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also add in here that data for organizations that are early on in their data maturity journey, that data is not just explicit data. There is so much data, to your point, if we are AI digital organizations, that is implicit data, the digital footprint of your employees in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And that is so powerful as well, because that tells you the behaviors around what's happening and why. It helps you answer the why as well. So there's both explicit and implicit data that we need to
Absolutely.
think
And
about.
I think speaking of data, one thing I want to add is it's a trust equation, right? So in this day and age, you can't just collect your employee data and be like, oh yeah, trust us. We're going to do what is right by all of you in terms of using it and popping into different models, different tool sets, etc. I think it doesn't come as a surprise to any of us that the corporation/organization and workforce trust equation has been broken for a very long time, and it continues to deteriorate as we've been seeing in the news and everything else. So with that in mind, I think the question I have for HR folks who are looking to implement AI is like, how do you take your workforce along the journey? How do you get transparent with them in terms of helping them understand why are certain things being implemented, why are certain changes being made, and what can they expect out of those changes?
That is so important. All right, so let's shift our focus to the world of vendors for a second. And in our conversations, you've mentioned that vendors often expect HR to act as experts. So how do these expectations create challenges for HR teams?
It's so interesting because of all the marketing teams I work with, as well as sales teams I work with, a lot of times I'll listen to their pitches as part of sales coaching. And sometimes I'll listen to them talk and you're like, hang on a second, you just said this term. Do you even know what that term means? And they're like, oh, no. The product team gave me that term and they told me that I should use it and everything sounds smart. I'm like, okay, let's go back. Does your product team understand what that means? And product's like, well, no, the engineers told me that this is the appropriate way of describing it. So we're going to use that, et cetera, et cetera. The prime example in this at the time of this recording is AI agents. Literally, when you go to market right now, most HR tech vendors will say like, oh, we have agentic AI, we have AI agents. Agentic AI is very different from AI agents, is very different from intelligent automation. But somehow we have, through that chain of networking interactions, amalgamated all of that together into AI agents. Now, as a buyer, I have to somehow become an expert in AI agents to know if you're truly selling me an AI agent or agentic AI. And that creates a lot of undue pressure in any sales pitch or any sort of demo environment that you go into. So going to your question, I think a lot of it is it's unintentional, but it's also done in such a way where like we're copy and pasting concepts without necessarily understanding how they impact our end users and without necessarily solving their challenges to begin with.
And if the vendor is selling something, promising something, and the buyer is just buying it, assuming with assumptions that once they light up the system, this is what the system is going to do, and it doesn't help either party. Like, yes, the buyer has to do damage control, but the vendor also loses trust and credibility with the person who bought this technology
I mean,
in the first
we're
place.
already seeing that, right? Like I take you back probably 10, 15 years with all the cloud implementations and the continuously ongoing cloud implementations where a lot is promised when you move into like an HCM system, that type of thing. Can the vendors do all of that? Absolutely. But there's so much nuance that isn't shared during the sales process. That level of trust, that partnership isn't there. So I work with quite a few vendors and they're like, oh, I'm wondering why our like demo cycle is getting longer and longer. Our conversion cycle is getting longer and longer. And I'm like, guys, the industry kind of screwed up. In order to gain a short-term dollar, we ended up like putting everything on the customers to make it happen. Your customers aren't experts. They're not going to be the ones that pick apart your tech stack and say like, oh, actually, I think you're missing XYZ or you didn't tell me about XYZ. They're trusting you to do the work. So until you end up build back that trust equation, yeah, your conversion cycles are going to be longer because your customers have been burned way too many times and eventually people do learn.
Yeah. So how do you see the vendors doing this differently this time around? What role should vendors play and how should they support the customer journey?
So I think a few of the vendors I work with are already doing that. So, I mean, obviously vendor comes with a spectrum of maturity as well. For me, it's really about that partnership. Again, going back to what I said earlier, if for whatever reason during any conversation about HR technology, the customer feels like they're not comfortable asking a question or they're made to feel lesser than for not knowing, I wouldn't question sort of whether they know or not. I would question the partnership and what kind of relationship that the vendor is trying to create by making you feel that disparity in knowledge, if you will. Because the good ones that I know and I work with, they take their customers on a journey with them. They meet their customers where they are. And there's a spirit of full disclosure in the very beginning in terms of what they can do, what they cannot do, and what they're willing to help the customers to do. I think on the buyer side, if you're ever feeling like you're rushed into a decision or a contract signing, just give yourself a moment and take a pause, because ask yourself, like, why is that sort of hurriedness happening? And why are you being rushed into that decision? And are you really ready for that decision? And whether that sort of like timeline is imposed by you or whether that's imposed by your vendor. Because I think taking a pause and kind of thinking through all of these questions will, again, give you a better indication of the type of partnership that you're looking for and the type of partner that you're working with.
That is so true. And Lydia, what role do you see vendors play in change management and in AI adoption for HR? I ask this because I've experienced all flavors, from no change management to some kind of change management, but it doesn't, translate into action, to full-blown change management.
Oh man, this is an interesting one. So I think my advice to all the buyers out there, don't ever expect your vendor to do change management for you. Like, here's the thing. They can try, they'll have all the templates and tools and resources available for you, but they don't have your context. Yeah. And having started out my career in change management, it takes a really long time to get the context right. The context leads to the verbiage. The verbiage leads to how your people feel about it when they go on that change journey with you. So short of doing it internally through your team, I wouldn't necessarily outsource all of that during any technology implementation, AI or otherwise. Where I think the vendors do really well in, at least the good ones that I've seen, is they give you the resources, they give you the options. So for example, part of the most painful things I think in change management is that communication execution. Because if you have 10 different stakeholder groups, you're customizing 10 different emails, 10 different posters, everything else. But the really good ones will give you the templates, the graphic designs, and even the graphic teams to work with that, where you just have to send an email, be like, group 1, I need this message. Group 2, I need that message. Like, help me come up with something. And they're able to support you in that journey. So I think for me, it's really the tactical help and maybe a little bit of the thinking, but it's definitely not the full execution. And quite honestly, one of the questions I would ask a vendor when it comes to implementation change management is, like, it's not so much, are you going to be able to help me in change management? It's more so, in your experience in supporting your customers, give me the really, really successful case study and give me the really horrendously everything has gone wrong case study, and judge for yourself if that was because of the vendor side or if it's because of the customer side, and what are some of the things that you can do better in your own journey.
Yeah, that is so true. I love what you said about not understanding the context of an organization from a vendor's perspective. And understanding the context is the starting point for building a change strategy in the first place. Yeah. Training and communication are tail end tactical approaches for change. But the biggest change happens in understanding who are my stakeholders. Why would there be resistance? Why would there be friction? Vendors are not going to know that. Like, we have to, as HR professionals, anyways have to build that muscle around facilitating change in our function, HR function, so that we can broadly support the organization, because change is the way to go. We have to support the change dynamic for the rest of the organization. I think that is one of the things that will help HR stay relevant, because AI is impacting people at the end of the day.
Yeah. And the other thing too, I think a lot of times HR buyers don't ask themselves is understand how your vendors make money, right? Because most of the time the technology you buy is software as a service. It's on the licensing agreement. When a business runs on a licensing agreement, where they spend most of their time and effort is the development cycle. It's a product roadmap. It's a delivery of the technical product. It's not the periphery services. Like they're not going to make money on a licensing tool by offering you all of the supporting services outside of what is bare bones and the necessity of it. So with that in mind, again, I would ask the question, if you're not making money off of me in doing that, why would you provide me that service? And how good can I truly expect the service to be?
All amazing points, Lydia. Thank you. So let's move to emerging trends. As someone who's deeply immersed in HR and AI, what trends or developments do you think will define the future of the space? And how do you envision the relationship between AI and HR over the next few years?
I honestly can't cast it out for the next few years because I will tell you, since I got into this space a little over a year ago, things that I thought would happen in 12, 18 months time has happened in like 3 to 6 months. So at this point, when people are like, yeah, what does next 5 years look like? I was like, no idea. I can cast you out maybe the next 12 months. I definitely cannot cast you out the next few years. So what does a relationship look like? I think it's really dependent on the HR team in question and how much they embrace change. For the ones, and just for context, I'm a personal believer that there's 3 categories of people or 3 categories of businesses when it comes to change. The ones who will refuse to change no matter what until the point of obsolescence. Mm-hmm. The ones who will change only when circumstances force them to, like when you run out of money, when your business is in trouble or anything along those lines. And then the ones who proactively look at themselves and change once every couple months, couple quarters, that type of thing. So applying that framework into how I think about HR, I think the ones who are more open to change and open to new things, they will thrive because there are so many tools out there right now that as long as you're understanding of how your team works and on principle, how you want your HR function to work and what kind of experience you want to deliver your employees, you can literally architect any sort of end user experience from a people perspective at very, very low cost value, if you will, given what's on the market right now. And yes, of course, like data security, everything else accounted for. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like you're now being given your own like Lego blocks in a way without having to understand how to craft those Lego blocks. You can actually build together what you want to do with individual Lego blocks and pretty much no code or very low code. I think for those who are more so like either forced to change or just kind of like, oh no, it's AI, it'll go away eventually. I think unfortunately we might have a moment of reckoning coming. The reduction in budget isn't going to change, especially as your C-suite executives, your investors, and your leaders keep hearing about the successful case studies, about those who are more open to the change. The budget reductions are going to keep going. The headcount reductions are going to keep going. So I think it's about where on that proactivity curve, if you will, the HR function wants to stand on. One thing that I'm very personally curious about is how does the HR operating model change by organization with AI? Because if you think about the 3-legged stool model that most of us are using or just any variation thereof, there are parts of it that will be rendered obsolete or will require very little effort. So now that we've elevated everyone from the admin and operation part into the more strategic end of the spectrum, will we see flatter HR structures? Will we see sort of like the thinker and then the final 20% doers with the middle tier taken care of by AI? That I'm not sure. And quite frankly, this is a one where I look at all of the HR practitioners as individuals to see how willing and open they are to change versus kind of writing out their role for as long as possible.
So on this, I would also ask you, what new capabilities should HR professionals be thinking about building and developing? Because to your point, I think that I echo the same sentiment that the anatomy of an HR function will look different, whether it takes 6 months, 12 months, couple of years. It's really hard to guess the timeline because things are just changing so rapidly. But in order for HR professionals to stay relevant and move towards the future of AI, what skills would you suggest that we should be thinking about and building now?
Yeah. So following sort of like the building blocks of AI, if you will, I think for me, first and foremost, is for HR folks to get comfortable with numbers. And by numbers, I mean data, how data is collected, how data is calculated. I know some of you are going to listen to this and tell me like, I didn't go to school to be a numbers person. I went to school to be a people person. Standing where we are now in the mid 2020s, you can't be a people person without being a numbers person. Those two are no longer, unfortunately, mutually exclusive concepts at this point. So I think the bare bones is understanding how data plays into HR. You don't need to be like a people analytics expert. You don't need to crank out your own dashboards, but just understand how data plays into HR and how data plays into how your business makes decisions pertaining to its operations, pertaining to its people. That's probably like the bare minimum foundational. Then I think for anyone who's looking to elevate their skill sets a little bit more, it's understanding how data feeds into technology and how an HR tech stack is architectured. Because I firmly believe that every CPO from this point onwards, if not a few years before, needs to be a technologist. You don't need to know how to wire your own integration together, and nobody's ever going to expect you to know how to wire your integrations together. But you do need to know enough about the different elements of a tech platform and the different elements of your HR tech stack that enables you to do your work on a daily basis and how all of that wires together into your larger enterprise tech stack, if you will. They're not scary concepts. Again, if you think about the concept in terms of Lego blocks, it's just building on the next level of it. And you definitely don't need to become an expert in like coding or knowing the types of integration maintenance, or anything along those lines to be just dangerous enough in understanding technology. And I think the next level from that is understanding sort of where AI can enable and the types of AI that can enable. So it's sort of, is it a chatbot that you're looking for? Is it like rule-based intelligence that you're looking for? Is it intelligent automation that you're looking for? Is it natural language processing? Is it machine learning? And do you really need machine learning to do the task that you're looking to solve? Because, I mean, AI has been around since the 1950s, which I think a lot of people neglect when we talk about it today. There is a huge variety on the spectrum of what AI can do and what AI is. So that to me is like that third level. And the fourth level, if you really, really, really want to get nerdy, one of the apps, and I'm not paid by these guys, but one of the apps I use myself, it's called Brilliant. And essentially it's a daily 10 to 15 minute learning segment that teaches you a little more about machine learning, like how the coding happens. How do you work in Python? And why is the coding in Python related to coding in AI? Like all of that, to kind of just get you into the next level. Again, you don't have to memorize all of that for your daily work, but it kind of helps you connect the dots of the conversations that you're listening to and maybe understanding the reason why DeepSeek kind of broke Wall Street a little bit a couple weeks ago, and how these new AI models are iteratively breaking people's expectations, so to speak.
Yeah. And I would also add that we don't have to think of us learning through this journey on our own. This is where
Absolutely.
AI can be our partner in this learning journey as well. You know, like we don't have to become data scientists, but we should know when to use technology to do the heavy lifting of what an expert would do. But we still have to be curious about layering in, to your point, that data in decision making. We have to be curious and ask the question, but we have enough technology around us to give us the answer.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
so before we get into the wrap up segment, I do want to ask you on this note: have you seen very micro, small use cases where in everyday practice, HR can leverage tools which are easily accessible, like ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot, if an organization is a Copilot shop, where they can start getting their feet wet and hands dirty with AI
Oh,
without
for
getting too
sure.
complicated about it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think one of my favorite ways of using AI, and literally anybody listening to this can do it. So I don't know if everyone else feels the same way, but for me, when I used to write emails to senior leaders or someone else like I'm not very familiar with, I get this like moment of minor panic going like, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to word this? Like, what's the best way to go about it? So instead of panicking myself with a piece of blank paper or a blank email template, I basically just go to ChatGPT and say like, hey, I need you to act as my role. You're writing an email to this person for this context. Like keep it to like maybe 5 lines and just draft an email, because I think a lot of people have a better time reacting to something that's presented in front of them and fine tuning it than they do creating from scratch. And that same concept can be used to any sort of mass emails, any communication that you want to write. You can definitely use it for any sort of communication calendar. And I think HR does quite a bit of that in terms of content that it's putting out. You can also use AI to role play a little bit with you. Ask your ChatGPT, your Gemini, again, pick your poison, to act as a certain role and kind of either do like a mock meeting with you or like have a mock conversation with you. And sometimes I even use it to say like, hey, if you're in this role and I'm about to have a conversation with you, what are your top 5 questions that you would ask me? So it helps you better prepare for whatever situation it is that you're about to walk into.
I love that example of role playing because I tried it personally as well when ChatGPT first came out a couple of years ago. The amount of real time contextualized coaching you can get with ChatGPT at the time was amazing. Like, not only can you ask it to ask you the right questions around, let's say, if you're trying to build negotiation skills or data savviness or data literacy skills, but you can also in your prompt ask it to evaluate your responses and coach you through what the right response should be. I will also pepper here that sometimes it's not 100% accurate, which is where we need to apply our critical thinking skills, but at least it's better than nothing.
It gets you 80% of the way there, right? That's what I always tell people. Like, something is better than nothing. Understand that every time you prompt it, you have to tweak on top of whatever the response is. But again, most people I know have a better time reacting to something than to come up with something net new and then react to it themselves.
Absolutely. Well, Lydia, this has been such an enlightening discussion. And before we wrap up, is there anything that we haven't touched on or talked about that you'd like to add?
I think that's more so on the personal side for the audience listening to this, because I know we talk a lot about AI at work, like AI for HR and stuff like that. One thing I do want everyone to be more cognizant of is that in the digital age where AI is thriving, the loneliness pandemic is also thriving as well. So it's completely normal for you to feel like there is a weird digital isolation bubble around you. And I would highly encourage those who are starting to feel that or have a sense of it to just reach out and build your own community. Because I think with digital enablement, you're also able to kind of curate the communities that you want to be a part of and those that you want to surround yourself with. And it's totally normal to kind of feel like you're in your little bubble with all this technology talk happening around you.
Well said. And that's a wrap for this episode of Tides. Huge thanks to Lydia for bringing her straight up wisdom and fresh perspective on how HR can navigate the AI wave, or like I say, AI tsunami. From embracing the right mindset to rethinking how we work with vendors, Lydia has definitely left us with a lot to think about and act on. If this conversation got you excited, curious, or even a little nervous about the future of AI in HR, you're not alone. Remember, it's not about having all the answers. It's about staying open and asking the right questions and being ready to explore. And if you want to hear more from Lydia, you can connect with her on LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe, leave a review, or share it in your network. Let's keep the conversation going.